All right, folks, the NFL has decided to gift us with two games. On Christmas Day, we have the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Houston Texans versus the Baltimore Ravens, and there are a load of fantasy contests. We have Draftkings, we have Fanduel, and of course, we have the draft games on Underdog. What we're going to do, we're going to run through how to win in all of those formats real quick. Let's find some shippers.
It's Short King Summer, dude. It just feels like no one in fantasy sports ever learns anything. Does he mistime it, or is Brock Bowers just a grown man? Brock Bowers is just a grown man. Dare I say, Rich, football might be back. In the words of Lane Johnson, this offense looks constipated. It's Short King Summer.
All right, right here, we have the projections that we need. I have got the solver pulled up. We're going to run through position by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. I've run the Sims on runthesims.com and on SimLabs on Rotogrinders, and we are going to find some winning lineups. The first thing you're going to see at quarterback, very bifurcated. Lamar projected for 22.9 on the two-game slate. He's going to be around 31% owned. Generally speaking, in a two-game slate, you're going to see 25, 25, 25, 25. There's going to be a relatively even distribution. What's happening is all of that ownership from Russell Wilson is piling towards Lamar Jackson. He is projected, 6 points better, 7 points better. There's a real reason for that. And in fact, in running the optimal lineups, these are just the top 150 stacks. You actually don't get that much Lamar because of the price tag. We're going to get into why that is a little bit later. I have stacks turned on with a minimum of two teammates. The two teammates restriction, which I think is pretty important for a short slate, is not going to be as favorable for Lamar. I think the ownership is a little bit wrong in this sense. I prefer Mahomes straight up for what he costs on DraftKings, 6,500 to Lamar. We've been getting rushing production from Patrick Mahomes. He ran for the touchdown last week. He's had another 4 days to rest from that ankle injury. They've been passing more in the red zone. Stroud, I think, is honestly the fool's gold play here. They are the most run pass team in the entire NFL. They're going to be even more negative PROE without Tank Dell in the lineup. And one of the things I'm concerned about is kind of just this systemic risk we see when NFL teams get cluster injuries. They had 2 linemen get injured against the Chiefs. Of course, their horrific injury to Tank Dell. John Mechie is going to be back this week for the Houston Texans, but he's going to be replacing Robert Woods, Xavier Hutchinson. It's not particularly great. We can look at the route shares here for John Mechie. Before he got injured, he was already trending down, while Robert Woods and Xavier Hutchinson were trending up. In fact, they had this guy, Jared Wayne, playing in some of these games, and Tank Dell actually saw his route share increase significantly. Another issue there is that Cade Stover is banged up, so they've been playing fullback. In order of preference for salary cap DFS, I rank them Mahomes first, Lamar second, Russell Wilson third. Of course, we're waiting to see if George Pickens plays in this contest or not. And then honestly, given that I expect him to be the second most owned quarterback, and I think that Nico Collins and CJ Stroud is going to be the most combo owned pair of the slate, in salary cap DFS, I want to be a little bit lighter on Stroud. Let's move to the running backs now. You guys are probably not ready for me to say this, but Derrick Henry is the best play of the slate. If he is actually less owned in the 2-game slate on either FanDuel or DraftKings than Joe Mixon, I think that it's very likely that the field has made a massive mistake. I also disagree with these projections a little bit. I think that Isaiah Pacheco should be projected better than Kareem Hunt. I think that their split in the most recent game had a lot to do with the fact that they are playing 3 games in 11 days. The Kansas City Chiefs are. That is going to limit Pacheco's workload a little bit, but this is the most important game. If you think about what the Chiefs have going on, they can lock up the 1 seed with a win here and then not have to play any of their starters in week 18 against the Denver Broncos. They would much prefer to get the win here. I think a simple thing you can do in your projections is adjust Pacheco up a little bit and adjust Kareem Hunt down just a smidgen. I think Hunt at 12 to 15% ownership in these lottery fields is still pretty strong. I think the Jaylen Warren ownership at 41% compared to Najee at 31%, they're effectively the same price. I mean, look, we all want Jaylen Warren to happen. Don't get me wrong. We all want Jaylen Warren to happen, right? We just do. But Najee Harris's route participation is still stronger than we would want it to be. His target share is definitely lower, and Jaylen Warren is the better pass catcher, but the red zone stuff is going to go to Najee Harris. And also, I think we are all well aware of what's going on with the Kansas City Chiefs right now. They're not pulling away from anyone. They're one of only 4 NFL teams to have not scored 30 points in the entire season. I would be surprised to see them, get up to a 21-0 lead. I think this game is going to be uglier than a lot of Kansas City Chiefs fans want it to be. So Najee, it's pretty early, but I think Najee looks like a pretty clear flag plant. Then we need to talk about some of the huge differential pieces. We have got Samaje Perine, who is a pretty large differential. I actually used one of my tags over on Rotogrinders in the expert survey on Samaje Perine. He does have that third down role. That third down role is unlikely to be productive, has not been productive. But when we're talking about sub 5% ownership for a guy with a red zone role, I think you need to be relatively interested. And then maybe the largest question of the slate is what happens on third downs for the Baltimore Ravens? Does Keaton Mitchell play that role? Does Rasheen Ali play that role? Is it neither of them? And is it actually just Patrick Ricard? Because I think it would be unwise and also out of character for Derrick Henry to play third downs. He's had a lot of opportunities in his career to play third downs, and he just never has. That's just the fact of the matter is he's not a prototypical third down back. I think particularly in showdown, you want to be taking a lot of shots on Keaton Mitchell and Rasheen Ali, probably less in the 2-gamer. Again, if you're playing these really large style lottery fields, 150 max, the Millie Maker, the Mini Max, you do probably want to throw some darts on Keaton Mitchell, Cordarrelle Patterson, who actually has that red zone role, scored a touchdown last week, and Dare Ogunbowale. Patterson will also play more if Pickens is not active in this game. Dameon Pierce, Ricard, Beck, Steele, I think you can leave those guys for dead. But I'll tell you, relative to projection, Najee Harris, Isaiah Pacheco, and Derrick Henry are my favorite plays of the slate. I think Mixon is probably one of the worst plays of the slate. His projection is worse than Henry's, but his ownership is more with only $500 in salary. Let's move now to the wide receiver grouping. We've got Nico Collins, who I think is a great example of good chalk. I mean, Nico Collins, his utilization for the Houston Texans, it's unbelievable. That he has a 26% target share on the year, 28% targets per route run, very healthy ADOT, very healthy air yard share, and his role is only going to grow. This is not a must-win game for the Houston Texans, but it's certainly a game that they would like to win, and then they'd be able to rest everyone next week. Pickens, I'm actually less interested in if he plays. I think he's fine at 33%, but I do prefer Flowers. Again, I think that missing Justice Hill is a pretty big deal for the short passing game. And Flowers is also going to be extra productive in a game that would end up being competitive. But I think here's your key to the slate. Who wins the $1 million or $500,000 on DraftKings on the Christmas Day slate? It's going to be the guy who picks Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins, and Hollywood Brown appropriately. Those guys are hard to categorize, and Hollywood Brown did not play very much, but the targets per route run were absolutely off the chart. He only ran 33% of the routes, but he got a 53% targets per route run, 20% of the team's targets overall. I think that this projection, I understand what is going on at ETR and at the solver that causes it to be 7.87, but I just could not disagree more about 11% ownership. He could very easily get there on 4 receptions. In fact, Mahomes just missed him at the end of the second quarter in week 16 for what would have been a touchdown on the right sideline. I would rank them Brown, Worthy, Hopkins in terms of how I would like to own them. But I think you could even make a rule to play a minimum of one of them in your tournament lineups. And Worthy's participation has just been unbelievable. The coaches are saying all the right things. The most recent 2 games, he's over 30% of the team's targets. He's over 30% targets per route run. He's just turning it on at the right time for this team. Then we have kind of the tertiary pieces. And these guys do oftentimes determine who wins these slates. Bateman at 4,800. I definitely prefer Brown to him. Mechie, I think, is a bit sneaky. Remember, this is the former 44th overall pick in the NFL draft. His career got sidelined by literally getting cancer. but he's largely looked better than some of the other tertiary pieces on the Texans. His targets per route run has been stronger than Xavier Hutchinson, stronger than Robert Woods, stronger than Cade Stover. So these other guys who are on the field for the Houston Texans have not shown any ability to earn targets, whereas Mechie has. For example, I prefer him to Woods. I prefer him to Austin. Austin, if Pickens plays, I think is honestly just a terrible play. I would much rather Mechie, and I might even rather Robert Woods just for the touchdown equity. Calvin Austin's role when Pickens has been on the field has been brutal. Then we're talking pure GPP punts after this. Hutchinson, Van Jefferson, Tylan Wallace, Mike Williams, Smith-Schuster, Justin Watson, I really wouldn't play at all. Devontae Walker, potentially, if Nelson Aguilar does not play, I think he is relatively in play, but we're going to get to who the real play on the Baltimore Ravens is when we get to tight end. Now, the field is doing the right thing. I think this almost looks exactly how the ownership should be, where Likely and Andrews are combinatorially owned way more than you would expect. Likely's route participation with Charlie Collar out has been very strong. I think it's something that we forgot because the production has not particularly been there. But if you look over the last month of the season, the week 12 air ball, then 23%, 8%, 13%, but 32%, 13, and 19% target shares. The ADOT is pretty healthy for a tight end. Likely has a role in the red zone. I think he looks like a particularly strong play in this slate because he's also going to be leverage off of his teammates. He's going to be leverage off Flowers. He's going to be leverage off Henry. He's going to be particularly leverage off Andrews. Now, the field is being a bit silly with this Travis Kelce stuff. Yeah, he's top 5 in the NFL in open score, bottom 5 in yak score. He can't move anymore. The guy's very old. He's, Travis Kelce falls down, and you can just kind of hear the sound he makes when he gets up. He goes, but he still gets open. The Kansas City Chiefs are the best team in the NFL on third downs. The reason why they're the best team in the NFL on third downs is largely because of Travis Kelce. So I think that the field only playing him at 36% and playing Worthy at 46%. I mean, look, I'm the biggest Xavier Worthy guy in the world, but that is just wrong. It's just wrong to distribute things that way. And then Schultz was actually the biggest beneficiary last week of Tank Dell being out. And you can see why that would be. Schultz is a fine target earner, but not a strong target earner. But you tank Dell off the field and you replace him with Robert Woods, Xavier Hutchinson, these guys who can't earn targets. And it's going to be more likely, particularly in a pass-heavy script where the Texans are dogs, that he will earn targets. But we have to talk about the number one gold star play of the slate. And of course, that is going to be the 4.9% owned Noah Gray. Now, is Noah Gray as good as people in my YouTube comments think he is? Probably not. But these are his numbers over the most recent month of the season. 14%, 15%, and then only 2% last week of the targets. But before that, 5 straight games with double-digit targets per route run. He's at 15% targets per route run on the year. And in fact, the broadcast last week actually had a pretty interesting anecdote. Generally speaking, you don't get great stuff from the broadcast, but I thought that this anecdote was pretty good, which was basically Mahomes told them on the film, he noticed that on third downs, particularly when Travis Kelce gets the double, it's generally Noah Gray's guy who shades towards Kelce, and you can see an uptick in third down targets for Noah Gray. So let's get to some of the top optimal lineups here on the solver. This is the number one double stacks teammate lineup with the setting for 50% projection, 50% ceiling, which is the way that I like to run things in the solver. It is a CJ Stroud double with Joe Mixon and Dalton Schultz. You've got Derrick Henry, you've got Joe Mixon, Worthy, and Hollywood, which is interesting because the solver projections do not particularly like Hollywood Brown. Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, and Stroud against the Ravens defense. The way the optimal projections have it broke down, 43% of the top lineups have Stroud, 29% of the top lineups have Russell Wilson, 70% of the top lineups have Lamar Jackson, 11% of the top lineups have Mahomes. Knowing that so much of the field uses the solver and ETR's projection to generate lineups, that makes me even more interested than I was in playing Mahomes instead of Stroud. And you can see how anyone who uses optimizers is just going to get a ton of Stroud because it's a points per dollars thing. The computer does not make much distinction between Stroud and Mahomes, even if we know their outcomes are much different. At running back, Henry is the most owned in terms of actual high-scoring lineups, then Jalen Warren, then Joe Mixon, then Najee Harris. Then you see a very interesting thing. Because of the way the Kansas City Chiefs projections are being middled, all of them in actual high projected lineups, I just ran 150 lineups by projected score. This is not a sim. You basically have the computer middling between Pacheco, Hunt, and Pirine. I think that's wrong. I think your actual distribution should look almost opposite of this. I think that your combined ownership of Chiefs running backs and your teams should almost certainly be higher than Joe Mixon. And in fact, if you gave me even money odds on a Chiefs running back outscoring Joe Mixon, I think that I might take it. Now, that might be a little bit misguided, but I think that I probably would. At wide receiver, Flowers is in 83% of the top lineups, Xavier Worthy in 67%, Nico only in 50% because there's not a outstanding amount of value, George Pickens, DeAndre Hopkins, Rashad Bateman, Hollywood Brown, then Mechie. Under 10%, it's Hollywood, Mechie, Calvin Austin, Hutchinson, Wallace, Woods, and Jefferson. This should give you a good sense of how the field is building. Every lineup is very likely to have one of Flowers or Worthy. Nico Collins is going to be far and away the top spend of the slate after Derrick Henry. Pickens will be owned right about at what he is projected. Hopkins, in my mind, is going to be a bit over-owned relative to his actual range of outcomes that he's displayed as a Chief. Bateman and Hollywood Brown also a little bit under-owned. Then another fascinating thing, you do a little bit of math and you see, well, the computer's giving us a ton of two tight end lineups because Andrews, 69%, Schultz, 64%. That's already clearly over 100%. Isaiah Likely, 32%. And then Freiermuth, Kelsey, and Gray are being shown in actual optimals less than their projected ownership. Again, I just cannot stand by and see Kelsey and Gray less owned than Freiermuth. I think both of them have very interesting individual ranges of outcomes. And combinatorically, the Noah Gray clicker is not clicking on Travis Kelsey. And it's very unlikely that the Kelsey clicker is clicking on Gray. And in fact, if we search for just Noah Gray lineups, we are going to see Kelsey is not showing up in these. The top Noah Gray lineup is Stroud, Warren, Mixon, Worthy, Nico, Flowers, Gray, Schultz, and the Chiefs. We are just not going to see him show up. That's just not what the computer is giving us. And I think that that is fairly interesting. Let's take a look over at Run the Sims at their most plus EV players. The top 5 plus EV players likely is number 1, then Flowers, then Kelsey, then Bateman, then Andrews, which is very interesting because this is not an optimal lineup run, but instead on Run the Sims, what they're doing is they're simulating the field and then they're showing what players are most likely to end up in winning lineups that are non-duplicated and that show up as plus EV in that sim. And it's all guys who are marginally owned other than Flowers on the teams that are projected to score a ton of points. As you would expect, the negative EV players, they're the fancy plays. They are your Keaton Mitchells. They are your Robert Woodses. They are your Darnell Washingtons, your Samaj Pirines. I might disagree with that a little bit, but it does go to show that even in a two-game slate, the players that do not project for very many points, turns out, they're pretty bad plays. And now let's head over to SimLabs and look at some of their top players. The highest exposure SimLabs player, and if you've never used SimLabs over on Rotogrinders before, it's very simple. It's basically a very simplified version of Sims, where it runs the sim based on the very loose inputs that you give it, and then returns lineups in those winning Sims. Henry, Flowers, Mixon, Kelsey, Pickens, Bateman, the favored picks there. The highest SimLabs rated lineup is a Lamar Henry double, a Joe Mixon bring back, DeAndre Hopkins, Rashad Bateman, John Mechie, Travis Kelsey, Freiermuth in the flex with the Kansas City Chiefs defense. I think the best plan of attack at this slate is very simple. I think it's you want to try and get as much Henry over Mixon as possible. I think you want to get as much Hollywood over Bateman and Hopkins is possible. And I think you want to play these tertiary tight ends, Isaiah Likely and Noah Gray, more than the field. So that is the salary cap DFS version of the slate. Now I think that we should head over to Underdog and check their draft games. So if you've never played on Underdog Fantasy for a 2-game slate before, there's no average draft position for these contests, and we've been given the number 1 pick. The name of this game is finding as many unique combinations as possible. Oftentimes, it makes the most sense to wait at quarterback and get whoever the room leaves you with Russell Wilson or CJ Stroud. Running back falls off precipitously after the top 2 guys, Derrick Henry and Joe Mixon, and then falls off quite a bit again after the 2 Steelers guys in Pacheco, from Najee Harris to Kareem Hunt. Wide receiver falls off huge. If Pickens doesn't play, and it does look like he probably will, he is clear to return to action in week 16, there's a huge drop-off to Flowers. Remember, this is half PPR scoring. I think that Worthy probably belongs in the Flowers tier. And if I was on Truth Serum, I would maybe tell you he's closer to the Nico Pickens tier. The field looks a bit too low to me on Worthy, Brown, and Hopkins. Your scroll range at wide receiver, I think John Mechie is probably your favorite. We have the first pick here. I think Derrick Henry is very clearly the first pick in this format. We saw how much it drops off at running back. We don't care a ton. And actually, weirdly, for a 2-game slate, generally we're scraping the bottom of the barrel at tight end. That's not true here, because we have got 2 tight ends on the Ravens who project solidly, and Mark Andrews and Likely. We've got 2 tight ends on the Chiefs with good probability of a touchdown in Kelsey and Noah Gray. And then the other teams in the slate have a tight end that they frequently use inside of their passing game in Dalton Schultz and Pat Freiermuth. So unlike most slates, we actually feel pretty good about our grouping here. This user on the turn starts with double wide receiver. They're going to feel pretty far behind at the running back position, as we are going to see. We take Derrick Henry, and we're actually going to be at an advantageous spot in this room where we're actually going to get some points at quarterback, because we are going to select Patrick Mahomes and get a 2-point boost in projection there. I don't really care much about the difference between Andrews or Kelsey. I don't care much about the difference between Warren, Pacheco, or Najee. We are going to select Hollywood Brown because this is, one, a more unique combinatorial pairing. Hollywood Brown is not going to be selected there often. Obviously, he is going to be drafted quite often with Mahomes, but not very often in this pairing with Derrick Henry. It's generally speaking sort of hard to get those players together. This drafter paired Lamar and Andrews. Something interesting, I think, to do in these underdog slates is 2 tight end lineups. Generally speaking, not a very common strategy, not a very popular strategy, but this week I think it is particularly good. This user and this user, MacMain and Antono25, they are waiting on quarterback, which is a very viable strategy. If you are at one of the slots that does not get Lamar or Mahomes, I think waiting on Stroud or Russell Wilson and getting whoever you get with the final selection, I would say it's maybe even optimal. You could argue that me taking Mahomes where I did was bad, and I should have taken Mark Andrews. Najee Harris and Jalen Warren go, so we are going to be left with whichever Chiefs running back we want. Kelsey goes, so we are probably going to wait tight end for our final selection. Dalton Schultz will probably go to Mac Main. He will end his draft with Dalton Schultz and CJ Stroud, which is a pretty good team. This user drafted a pretty good team. No scrolls on this team, so very high potential for it to be duped in the primetime Palooza. We are now up. We are going to take Kareem Hunt. So we are a little bit weaker at running back. We can see that 2v2. We are then actually going to take Dalton Schultz, and we are going to do a scroll wide receiver for our final selection. Mac Main might be a little bit upset at me, but we have Derrick Henry, Patrick Mahomes, Hollywood Brown, Kareem Hunt, and Dalton Schultz. No Bo Sox has quite a strong team here. Lamar, Worthy, Mark Andrews, and Isaiah Pacheco. Now, I think a great pick for him in this format would be someone like Tylan Wallace. I probably, with that combination, like if you have a combination that is going to be that popular on a 2-game slate, I do think you want to do something weird with your final pick. He maybe even could take a Samaj P. Ryan or something like that. This is a little bit of a tactical mistake here, taking Russell Wilson, the drafter behind him. There's just no difference in this user's lineup between Russell Wilson and CJ Stroud, really. He doesn't have a Texan. He doesn't have a Steeler. Little bit of a mistake there. So this drafter is going to end with CJ Stroud. You'd maybe slightly prefer CJ Stroud there. He's slightly higher projected in the solver. We need to figure out who we're going to take with our final wide receiver pick. Now, I like Mechie, but the problem with Mechie is he is going to be drafted at, a 50, 55% rate here. I think you're almost much better off going with a wide receiver. There's also a nice little angle here with Nelson Aguilar, where Nelson Aguilar is going to be, he's questionable. So that leaves us a swap available. So we are either going to take Xavier Hutchinson or we are going to take Nelson Aguilar. We could also take Justin Watson. We have Mahomes. Let's take Juju Smith-Schuster and hope that he records a touchdown again, a very low drafted player. So that is a look at how to do the draft games on Underdog. That is a look at Christmas Day NFL Daily Fantasy on Draftkings and on Underdog. Folks, I, of course, wish you all a very happy Christmas. I hope you have a great day with your families. If you like the video, like the video. If you like what I have to offer, subscribe. And if you really like what I have to do, consider becoming a member of the YouTube channel. There's a button to join right below there on your screen. You click that join button. You can come hang out with us in Discord. Everyone, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. I hope that you all have a fantastic holiday season, and I'll see you back on the stream soon.
It's Short King Summer, dude. It just feels like no one in fantasy sports ever learns anything. Does he mistime it, or is Brock Bowers just a grown man? Brock Bowers is just a grown man. Dare I say, Rich, football might be back. In the words of Lane Johnson, this offense looks